The observations were my secret burden, a catechism of failure I recited to myself in the quiet hours after the court had retired. While other archduchesses dreamt of duels and hunts, my mind was a ledger of deficits and troop numbers. I saw the gilded eagles on our standards, magnificent and proud, and yet they seemed to molt before my eyes, their strength an illusion held together by parchment, and my father's desperate hope. That parchment, the Pragmatic Sanction, was meant to be my shield. I feared it was merely a paper target. My Francis, my dear Stephen, saw it too, but through a different lens. He was a man of science and finance, of tidy accounts and logical conclusions. He would walk with me in the gardens of the Hofburg, his hand warm in mine, and speak of crop rotation in his native Lorraine, or a new method for minting coins. "Teresa," he would say, his voice a gentle comfort, "these things can be fixed. A new tax system here, a renegotiated loan there." He saw problems to be solved. I saw a body politic riddled with a deep, consuming sickness, where every cure would be met with the violent resistance of the entitled. I loved him for his optimism, his unwavering belief in order. But love could not fill a treasury nor forge cannon. The autumn of 1740 was heavy with rain, and a sense of foreboding. My father, who had always seemed as immutable as the Alps, was fading. The robust man who had wrestled Europe into acknowledging his decree was now frail, his energies consumed by a final, fatal illness after a hunting trip. The whispers in the palace corridors, once like the rustling of dry leaves, became a torrent. Ministers huddled in corners, their faces grim masks of calculation. I felt their eyes on me, not with sympathy, but with appraisal. They looked at my swollen belly, for I was heavy with child again, and I knew what they saw, not a successor, but a woman, a vessel, a complication. On the 20th of October, the end came. I was summoned to his chambers. The air was thick with the cloying scent of beeswax, incense and mortality. My father's breath was a shallow rasp. He reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly firm, a last ember of his imperial will. His eyes, clouded with pain, sought mine. "My Theresa," he whispered, the words a struggle. "Hold fast. For Austria." He did not say be strong or rule well. He said, hold fast, as if he knew that all that was coming was a storm, and my only task was to be the anchor that kept his world from being swept away. Then there was only silence. The silence of a stopped clock, of a dynasty's interrupted breath. In that moment, the albatross around my neck became a crown of lead. I was no longer an observer of the empire's flaws, I was responsible for them. The next morning, I entered the Privy Council chamber. The room was a cavern of dark wood and disapproving portraits of my male ancestors. The ministers, men my father had relied upon for decades, stood as I entered. They were a sea of grey heads and skeptical eyes. Count Zinzendorf, the grizzled chancellor, bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone funereal, "we are convened to discuss the transition. His Highness, the Grand Duke of Tuscany," he nodded toward my husband, who stood beside me, "will surely guide us in these difficult times." A cold, clear rage, a feeling I had never truly known, settled in my heart. They were already erasing me, looking to Francis as a regent, a de facto emperor. They saw me as a broodmare whose name was merely on the deed. I took a breath, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Every eye was on me. "Count Zinzendorf," I said, my voice clearer and colder than I expected. "My husband will offer his counsel, for which I will be grateful. But the guidance of this empire rests with me." I moved to the head of the table, to the great carved chair that had been my father's, and remained standing. The Pragmatic Sanction is not a suggestion to be debated, it is the inviolable law of this land, my father's law, and now, mine. A stunned silence followed. I met their gazes one by one, letting them see the daughter of Charles VI, not just the wife of Francis Stephen. I saw a flicker of something in their eyes, surprise, perhaps a grudging respect, but mostly deep-seated doubt. They believed a woman's hand was too soft to hold the scepter. The weeks that followed were a blur of state papers, mourning rituals, and the quiet, constant pressure of their disbelief. Every decree I issued, every appointment I made, felt like an audition, yet A fragile hope began to kindle within me. The other powers of Europe had sworn oaths. My father had spent a lifetime and a fortune securing them. Surely their honor would hold. That hope was shattered on a bitter December day. A messenger arrived, his horse lathered, his face pale with dread and exhaustion. He knelt before me, his dispatch trembling in his hand. He did not need to speak. I saw the stark horror in his eyes. I broke the seal myself. The words were a declaration of war disguised as a cynical offer. Frederick of Prussia, the young king who wrote poetry and played the flute, the man my father had called a philosopher, had marched his armies into my province of Silesia. He had not even bothered with a pretense. He cited some dusty, long-forgotten claim, a legal spectre, summoned to justify naked theft. He had sworn to uphold the sanction. His signature was there, on the treaty, beside all the others. The paper crackled in my clenched fist. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it burned away any lingering fear or girlish uncertainty. The vultures were no longer circling, they had descended. I looked up from the dispatch, my gaze sweeping across the anxious faces of my court. My husband's hand found mine, a silent offering of support. But this was a burden he could not share. This was mine alone. They all saw a 23-year-old woman, pregnant and grieving, whose inheritance was being torn apart before she had even properly claimed it. They saw a victim. I let them look, and in the fire of my fury, I felt myself being forged into something new. They thought they were preying on a girl. They would soon learn they had woken a queen. My voice, when it came, was unnaturally calm. It cut through the terrified whispers of my ministers like a shard of ice. "Count Starhemberg," I said, my eyes locking on the oldest and most fretful of them, "you will draft a reply. Inform His Majesty of Prussia that the Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary does not negotiate with thieves. She fights them." The old man blanched, his face the color of tallow. "Your Majesty, our armies, our treasury, are in a deplorable state, I know," I finished for him. "And will they improve while we wring our hands and debate the precise wording of our surrender? No. We will raise new regiments, we will find money. We will secure our allies." "And who are they?" Another voice dared, bolder than the rest. It was Kinsky, a man who saw treaties as ledgers and loyalty as a commodity. "The French will side with Bavaria. The Spanish will see opportunity in Italy. The Elector of Saxony covets Bohemia. Your Majesty, the sanction is a dead letter. We are alone." He was right, of course. The terror was a rational response. My inheritance was a banquet laid out, and every hungry prince in Europe had just been handed a knife and fork. But their logic was the logic of defeat. It was the careful arithmetic of men who had only ever advised a king, an emperor. They did not understand the primal fury of a mother defending her nest. "We are not alone," I said, my gaze sweeping over them again, daring any one of them to meet it. "We have our people, we have our honor, and we have God." I let the words hang in the air, a trinity of faith, duty, and defiance. I did not mention that my faith in the promises of men was utterly shattered. From now on, I would trust only in steel, and in the fierce, desperate love I felt for the child growing within me, and the lands that were its birthright. The first months were a living nightmare. Every dispatch brought news of another betrayal, another incursion. The Bavarian elector, Charles Albert, a man who had sworn fealty to my father, declared himself the rightful heir and marched on Prague. French armies crossed the Rhine to support him. The vultures had called their friends to the feast. My Vienna was filled with refugees and whispers of siege. I worked until my eyes burned, poring over maps with generals whose advice was a constant demoralizing chorus of retreat and consolidation. I signed decrees until my fingers were stained with ink, trying to conjure funds from an empty exchequer. Francis was my rock, his quiet strength a balm in the lonely hours after the court had retired. He would hold me as I wept from sheer exhaustion, his hand resting on my swollen belly, a silent promise that we were in this together. But when the morning came, he would go to his hunting or his alchemical studies, and I would return to the council chamber. The burden of the crown was absolute. It could be loved, but not shared. The situation grew desperate. Prague fell. My generals advised me to abandon Vienna itself and flee to the Tyrol. It was then, in the darkest hour, that a flicker of an idea, a wild and reckless gamble, took hold. Hungary, my ancient, fractious, fiercely independent kingdom. The Hungarian nobles had always chafed under Viennese rule, jealously guarding their ancient privileges. They were warriors, but they were not my warriors. They had accepted my coronation grudgingly. To them, I was not their beloved sovereign. I was a German woman, a Habsburg, the latest in a line of rulers to be tolerated, not loved. But they had sworn an oath. And they were, if nothing else, men of honor. My advisors called it madness. To travel to Pressburg, to place myself at the mercy of the notoriously volatile Hungarian Diet, was to risk humiliation and outright rejection. They will demand 1,000 concessions, Kinsky warned. They will bleed us dry for a few thousand men. Then we shall bleed, I replied, my mind made up. For what is the point of a full treasury in a lost kingdom? I entered the great hall of the castle of Pressburg. On a grey September morning, I dressed not as an empress, but as a grieving daughter and a queen in peril. I wore the traditional deep black of Hungarian mourning, unadorned by jewels. On my head rested the ancient sacred crown of St. Stephen, its tilted cross a heavy weight on both my brow and my soul. I walked alone, my ladies remaining at the door, my pregnancy obvious beneath the dark velvet. A hush fell over the assembly. Hundreds of Magyar nobles, bearded and stern in their fur-trimmed coats and gleaming armor, watched my approach. Their faces were hard, unreadable masks of suspicion. I could feel their resentment, their centuries of stubborn pride. I was an intruder, a supplicant. I mounted the dais and turned to face them. I did not speak in the formal German of my court, or the Latin of diplomacy. I spoke to them in their own tongue, a language I had practiced until my throat was raw. My speech was not a litany of my legal rights or a reminder of their feudal duties. I spoke of the peril facing the kingdom, their kingdom. I spoke of the oath their fathers had sworn to my father. Then, I let the mask of composure fall. I let them see the 23-year-old woman, the frightened mother. Tears I no longer had to feign welled in my eyes. The affairs of our kingdom are in a desperate state, I confessed, my voice cracking with genuine emotion. Abandoned by my friends, persecuted by my enemies, attacked by my relatives. I have no one to turn to but you. I place into your hands the daughter of your king and her son. A murmur went through the hall. It was a gamble on the heart, not the head. I was a defenseless woman, yes, but I was their queen. I was appealing not to their duty, but to their chivalry, their very identity as the proud defenders of the realm. For a long agonizing moment, there was only silence. I saw doubt warring with pride on their weathered faces. Then, one of the oldest magnates, a man with a beard as white as snow, drew his saber. The rasp of steel was deafening in the stillness. Another followed, then another, and another, until the entire hall was a forest of gleaming blades held aloft. A single voice roared out, and it was taken up by hundreds, a deep, resonant cry that shook the very rafters of the castle. Vitam et sanguinam pro rege nostro, Maria Theresa. Our life and blood for our queen, Maria Theresa. They called me queen. In that moment of fire and steel, they had not just offered me their swords, they had given me their fealty, their hearts. They had accepted me, not as the wife of an emperor or the daughter of another, but as their rightful ruler. I stood before them, the tears now flowing freely, and I knew I had not just won an army. I had won a kingdom. The war was far from over. Silesia, my beautiful Silesia, might yet be lost. But the House of Habsburg would endure. Frederick, the poet king, had sought to write my epitaph. Instead, with his cynical betrayal, he had forced me to write my own beginning. And it would be a story written not in ink, but in blood and iron. The echoes of Hungarian cheers faded as my carriage rumbled back towards the Hofburg Palace, leaving the fields of glory for the gilded cages of Vienna. The tears had dried on my cheeks, leaving behind the tight, salty feeling of resolve. In that field, I had been a queen begging for her birthright. In this carriage, I was an empress forging her empire. The distinction was everything. My first war council after that day was not with generals, but with the powdered, bewigged counts who ran my treasury and my chancellery. They sat before me in a chamber heavy with the scent of old velvet and complacency, their faces a gallery of polite, entrenched condescension. They spoke of tradition, of ancient charters, of the delicate balance of privileges that held the Habsburg lands together like fragile porcelain. "Your Majesty," began Count von Harrach, his voice as smooth and oily as the pomade on his wig, "to tax the estates of the nobility and the church is unthinkable. It is an affront to the very foundations of your realm." I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy cloak. I looked from his face to the others, seeing the same sentiment reflected in their eyes. They thought me a girl, emotional and pliable, swayed by the cheers of an army. They did not yet understand the woman Frederick's ambition had hammered into shape. "Foundations, Count," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the chill of the Bohemian winter. "I have just returned from a war where those foundations proved to be sand. Frederick's cannons were not halted by your ancient charters. Our soldiers went without proper boots while your estates went without a proper tithe. The foundation of this realm is not privilege, it is survival. And survival has a price." I laid out my plans, not as a proposal, but as a decree. The Austrian and Bohemian chancelleries would be merged. A central directory would oversee the administration of the entire state. Their traditional roles, their comfortable sinecures passed down through generations, would be replaced by salaried officials, men of talent, not just title, loyal to me and to the state I was building. And yes, they would be taxed, all of them. The room erupted. It was a polite, aristocratic riot of spluttered objections and veiled threats. They spoke of their loyalty, but what they meant was their power. I saw it then, so clearly. My war was not just against the Prussians on the battlefield, it was against these men, here in my own palace. This was the second front, the war of ink and ledgers, and it was just as vital as the war of blood and iron. I dismissed them with a wave of my hand, their simmering resentment a fuel for my own fire. The revenues, slow and grudging at first, began to flow. The groaning apparatus of the state began to turn, its gears oiled by the wealth of those who had never before paid to keep it running. I used that money not for palaces or courtly extravagance, but for the one thing that had almost cost me everything, my army. I stood on a training ground outside the city, the mud of early spring clinging to my boots. Before me were not the ragged local levies of the past, but the beginnings of a true standing army. Thousands of men in clean white uniforms moved as one, the sun glinting off the tips of their bayonets. New cannons, cast in our own foundries, stood ready. I had established military academies to train a new generation of officers, men who would win their commissions through merit and tactical acumen, not because their grandfathers had owned a sprawling estate in Moravia. My general, Dawn, stood beside me, his usual grim expression softened by a flicker of pride. "They are learning, Your Majesty. They are disciplined, professional. Never again, Marshal," I vowed. The words a promise to myself, and to the ghosts of the soldiers we had lost. Never again will Austria be caught unprepared. Frederick thinks of war as a game of kings. I will teach him it is a science of states. But the iron of a strong army was not enough. A kingdom needed bones, a legal framework to hold it together. My nights were spent not at balls or operas, but in my study with legal scholars, surrounded by mountains of parchment. We began the painstaking work of codifying the laws of my disparate lands, seeking to create a single, unified legal system. It was a generational task, a dream I might never see fully realized, but a foundation that had to be laid. In the midst of this grand project, I came across the transcripts of a witch trial from one of the provincial towns. The details, the forced confessions under torture, the nonsensical accusations, the brutal execution, made my stomach churn. This was not justice. This was barbarism, a relic of a darker age that weakened us, made us look backward and superstitious in the eyes of the world. That night, I drafted the decree myself, my hand never wavering. Torture was abolished. Witch burning was outlawed. My advisors cautioned me, telling me I was meddling with local customs, that I was moving too fast. But I remembered the faces of the nobles in the council chamber, clinging to their own cruel traditions. The The state I was building would be rational, efficient, and, where it could afford to be, humane. It was a strength, not a weakness. I even began the process on my own crown lands, ending the personal servitude of the peasants, allowing them to marry and move without their lord's permission. It was a small crack in the monolithic wall of feudalism, but a crack through which a little light could shine. Years passed, a blur of work, of childbirth, of constant grinding pressure. Francis, my dear husband, was my anchor, the one soul who saw not just the Empress, but the woman beneath the crown. One evening, he found me staring out the window, looking north, always north, in the direction of Silesia. "You have changed everything, Maria," he said softly. "Vienna is not the city it was. The empire is not the empire you inherited. It is not yet the empire it needs to be," I replied, my voice weary but firm. Frederick still held my province. The story was not over. He had sought to write my epitaph as the last of the Habsburgs. Instead, he had forced me to become the first of a new kind. The blood had been the price of my throne. The iron was the will I used to keep it. He had intended to be my executioner. Instead, he became my crucible. And I was not finished burning. Francis left me to my vigil, his hand a lingering warmth on my shoulder. The fire within me did not seek the immediate blaze of a battlefield. That was Frederick's way, the gambler's throw. My fire was the slow, deliberate heat of the forge, meant to reshape the very metal of the state. If I could not reclaim Silesia with cannons tomorrow, I would forge an empire that would, in time, make its return inevitable. An empire so strong, so orderly, so Habsburg in its divine right, that the Prussians' stolen jewel would look like a trinket torn from a giant's crown. The next morning, the scent of wax and new paper filled my study. Spread before me were not maps of troop movements, but architectural plans for the new Vienna, General Hospital, and drafts of the Allgemeine Schulordnung, the General School Ordinance. I worked with a ferocity that my generals might have envied. Each line I approved, each budget I allocated, was a blow against Frederick's legacy. He had built an army, I would build a people. My personal physician, the brilliant but severe Gerard van Swieten, stood beside me, pointing a bony finger at a diagram of a maternity ward. Clean linens, Empress, an instruction for the midwives. We lose too many mothers, too many infants. A healthy populace is a productive one. He did not need to convince me. The ghosts of my own lost children were a constant, silent counsel. I had seen what the pox could do, how it could steal the light from the brightest eyes. My grief had been a private agony. Now it would be forged into public policy. We would champion inoculation. We would demand autopsies to learn from the dead how to better protect the living. It was practical. It was necessary. It was a queen's duty to her subjects, but it was a mother's promise to her memory. "And the schools, Your Majesty?" asked my minister. "Compulsory education for all children from 6 to 12. It is radical. It is essential," I countered, not looking up from the page. "Frederick's soldiers know how to march. My subjects will know how to read, to count, to reason. An army of clerks, of doctors, of engineers. They are as vital as an army of grenadiers. The strength of this empire will no longer be measured merely by the number of men we can put in the field, but by the minds we can put to work within our borders." This new Vienna became a city of purpose. The sound of construction was as common as the peal of church bells. We built not just for today, but for a century hence. Yet even in this grand rational design, there were moments of pure, unquantifiable beauty that took me by surprise. One afternoon, I was walking through the mirrored gallery at Schönbrunn when I heard it, a cascade of notes. From a harpsichord, so intricate, so full of a joy that was almost painful, it stopped me in my tracks. Peeking inside, I saw the boy, Wolfgang Mozart, his small legs dangling far from the floor, his head barely visible over the instrument. My own children, Maria Antonia and Ferdinand, were there, listening with a rapt attention they rarely gave their tutors. The boy was a prodigy, a miracle. We had him to court, gave him clothes from my children's own wardrobes, treated him with a strange mix of awe and familial affection. He finished with a flourish, and the silence that followed felt holy. Francis, who had joined me, murmured, "A gift from God, surely." Indeed, I agreed. But the pragmatist in me was already calculating. And an expensive one. What is the use of such a man in the long run? Can he command a regiment? Can he design a tax code? The thought was unworthy, I knew, even as it formed. His music was a testament to the glory of God and the culture of my court, yet I could not shake the feeling that his genius was a luxury, a beautiful, fragile flower in the iron garden I was cultivating. My garden, however, had high, unbreachable walls, and these walls were built of faith. My pragmatism, my embrace of science and learning, ended abruptly at the door of the church. One evening, my council was debating the status of Protestant craftsmen in Bohemia. A minister, a clever man I respected, suggested that granting them a degree of tolerance would encourage skilled workers to remain, boosting the economy. The air in the chamber grew cold. I set down my pen and looked at him, my gaze as hard as any northern winter. "Tolerance," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "You speak of tolerating heresy as if it were an inclement season. It is not weather, sir. It is a rot, a cancer in the soul of my people." I stood, my hands flat on the great oak table. "I have introduced reforms to heal their bodies. I have founded schools to sharpen their minds. Shall I then abandon their immortal souls to the lies of heretics for the sake of a few extra guilders? I rule by the grace of God Almighty. My first and most sacred trust is to Him. There will be no tolerance. This is, and will remain, a Catholic empire, indivisible and absolute." I swept from the room, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. They did not understand. Francis, perhaps, came closest. He saw the mother, the reformer, the beleaguered sovereign. But even he could not see the core of me, the part that had been forged in that first desperate war. Frederick had tried to take my birthright, to unmake the holy order of succession. My response could not only be temporal, it had to be spiritual. Every school built, every hospital founded, every road paved was an act of strengthening God's chosen domain. And every heretic suppressed, every Jew expelled from Prague in those early desperate years, was a purging of that same domain. Later that night, I found myself once more at the window, staring into the dark. It was all one and the same to me. The iron will that sent Van Swieten into the pox-ridden slums was the same iron will that refused to bend on the question of faith. One could not exist without the other. They were two faces of the same coin, the preservation and sanctification of my house, my lands, my people. Frederick had thought me a weak woman, a prize to be carved up. He had not understood. He had awakened a force of nature, a mother defending her young. And a mother will build the strongest house imaginable for her children, but she will also burn down anything, and anyone, she believes might threaten them from within. The burning was far from over. I had an empire to finish. The cold of the palace stone seeped through my slippers, a familiar anchor in the shifting sea of the night. My gaze drifted from the dark outline of the Vienna woods to the reflection ghosting against the glass. A woman not yet old, but with the years etched not in her skin, but in the unyielding set of her jaw. An empress, a mother. The two were inseparable, woven into the very fiber of my being. I turned from the window. The vast silence of the Hofburg was a deceptive thing. It was not empty, but filled with the weight of unsent dispatches, unspoken decrees, and the restless ghosts of problems yet to be solved. My hand trailed along the cool silk of a wall hanging, my fingers tracing the double-headed eagle of my house. My house, not Francis's, though I had loved him with a fierceness that had surprised us both. Not Joseph's, not yet, mine, entrusted to me by God and circumstance, and I would sooner see it turn to ash by my own hand than let it crumble through neglect. On my writing desk, beneath the soft glow of a single candelabra, lay a memorandum. The script was my son's, bold, impatient, and utterly certain. Joseph, my heir, my CO regent, my clever, difficult boy. He was a fire, much like me, but his burned with a different fuel. He was mesmerized by the new philosophies whispering out of France, the talk of reason and rights, of the state as a machine to be perfected. He saw the rot in the ancient timbers of the empire, and his only instinct was to tear it all down and build anew from a blueprint. The memorandum was a proposal for a new tolerance patent. It argued, with cold logic, for extending rights to Protestants and even the Jews, claiming it would spur commerce and tether their loyalties to the crown rather than to their co-religionists abroad. He saw them as economic units, potential assets. He did not see them as souls. He did not understand that the heart of this empire, the mortar that held its disparate bricks, of Hungarians, Bohemians, Croats and Austrians together, was the one true Catholic faith. To invite heresy into the halls was to welcome the wolf into the nursery. I picked up the document, the parchment cool and smooth. It felt dangerous, like a perfectly crafted but poisoned blade. Joseph believed this was part of the building. He could not see it for the burning it truly was, a slow, insidious fire that would consume the spirit of our people, leaving behind a hollow shell of secular efficiency. He did not understand sanctification. His house would be strong perhaps, but it would have no soul. My mind drifted to another fire, a more literal one. The war. Frederick's War. I remembered the couriers arriving day and night, their faces grim with news of defeat. I remembered the generals, proud men in their immaculate uniforms, explaining away their failures with talk of terrain and supply lines, their eyes avoiding mine. They saw a young woman on the throne, a prize to be defended or lost. They did not see the mother. In the great hall in Pressburg, holding the infant Joseph in my arms, as I appealed to the Hungarian nobles they had finally seen. They had pledged their lives and fortunes not to an abstract crown, but to a mother and her child. That was a power Frederick, with all his grenadiers and perfect battlefield geometry, could never comprehend. I had built my army from that moment, forged it in the heat of humiliation. New taxes, new academies, new regulations. The nobles had screamed, of course. They always did when their ancient, useless privileges were touched. Their titles were like crumbling tapestries they wrapped themselves in, blind to the fact the threads were rotten and the moths had eaten the glory away. Trimming their power was not destruction, it was pruning a great tree so that it might grow strong and straight towards heaven, not collapsing under the weight of its own dead branches. This, Joseph understood. On this, we were aligned. The burning of aristocratic deadwood was a fire we could tend together. But faith was different. It was the roots of the tree, unseen but essential. My piety was not for show, not a tool of statecraft. It was the bedrock of my world. How could I explain to my son, with his love of Voltaire and his disdain for superstition, that my prayers before a battle were as vital as the cannons? That sending missionaries into Bohemia to bring Protestants back to the fold was as important as building roads? To him, it was weakness. To me, it was the ultimate source of strength. An empire united in God cannot be broken by men. I dipped my quill in the inkwell. At the bottom of Joseph's memorandum, I began to write. Not a refusal. He was too proud for that, and he was the future. A direct confrontation would only harden his resolve. Instead, I began to amend, to temper, to redirect. Yes, some easing of restrictions perhaps, for skilled Protestant artisans in certain cities. A practical concession he would appreciate. But the core of the laws, the primacy of the Holy Mother Church, would remain untouchable. The Jews? They would remain under the old restrictions. They were a people apart, a permanent wound in the side of Christendom, and to grant them succor was to invite God's displeasure. It was a cruel necessity, a surgeon's cut to prevent a greater infection. Another small, necessary fire. My children were my other great project. Each marriage was a brick laid in the foundations of a lasting peace. My little Antonia in France, Caroline in Naples, Ferdinand in Modena. They were Habsburg's first, children second. Their happiness was a secondary concern to the security of our house. Was that monstrous? Perhaps. But a mother building a fortress for her family cannot worry about the splinters she gets in her hands. She must think of the wolves outside the walls. The candle flame dipped and swayed, casting my shadow long against the wall. It was the shadow of a giant, a matriarch. The burning was far from over. There were monasteries grown fat and lazy, laws riddled with contradiction, provinces still clinging to their own selfish ways. I had an empire to finish, a house to make safe for generations to come. Joseph would inherit a structure of iron and stone, sanctified and whole. And if he did not understand the sacrifices made to build it, that too was a mother's burden to bear. The children do not need to know the cost of the roof over their heads, only that it is strong enough to weather any storm. I signed my name, the ink a dark slash in the flickering light. Then, I snuffed out the candle and welcomed the familiar watchful dark. That night I dreamt about the weight of the crown, not just upon my head, but pressing down on my very soul the day I ascended. A woman, barely 23, inheriting an empire teetering on the precipice of ruin. They called me Your Majesty, but their eyes, those of the ministers and generals, whispered pray. The scent of betrayal hung heavy in the air, a premonition of the wolves already circling the carcass they believed the Habsburg realm would become. Bohemia, Hungary, Austria, a patchwork quilt of nations, each thread fragile, ready to unravel. Silesia was already lost, a brutal testament to the rapaciousness of Frederick. My father, dear Emperor Charles, had died, leaving behind not a stable legacy, but a testament to how easily a powerful name could falter. My first years were a blur of desperate diplomacy, whispered prayers, and the chilling reality of war. The War of the Austrian Succession was less a conflict and more a trial by fire, a bloody validation of my right to exist, to rule. I had faced down armies, yes, but the fiercest battles were often fought in the gilded halls of Habsburg, against the entrenched power of my own court. I saw the faces of my people, their lives bound by ancient chains, the serfs tied to land they did not own, their harvests dictated by the whims of a distant lord. I saw the vast wealth of the church, untouched by imperial taxation, its coffers swelling while the treasury bled to fund battles that protected their very lands. The nobility, their faces etched with generations of inherited privilege, scoffed openly at any suggestion of change, their loyalty a fragile coin that often fell on the side of self-interest. No, this would not stand. My words, when I first spoke of taxing the church, of dismantling the feudal system, echoed like thunder. The cardinals blanched, their rosaries clutched tight as if seeking divine intervention against my decrees. The old dukes and counts, their powdered wigs bristling with indignation, muttered, "A woman's folly, daring to believe their ancient rights superseded my crown." I remember Count Kinsky, red-faced and sputtering, arguing that God himself had ordained their exemptions. I met his gaze, my voice steady despite the tremor in my heart. "God, Count," I said, my hand resting on the carved arm of my throne, "also ordained that a sovereign must provide for her people. And if the church is Christ's earthly representative, then surely it must bear its share of earthly burdens, as must all who hold land under the Habsburg sun." It was a battle of wills, a slow, grinding war of attrition against centuries of tradition. But I held firm. I appointed new men, men loyal to me and to the future I envisioned, not merely to their own estates. The resistance was fierce, but I had learned early that true power wasn't just inherited. It was earned through unwavering will, tempered by a vision greater than oneself. The people, my people, they were the heart of this empire, the foundation upon which its strength would be built. I had witnessed their suffering, the children with bright eyes but no hope of learning, the villagers succumbing to preventable ailments, their lives cut short by ignorance and neglect. Why should knowledge be the sole preserve of the wealthy? Why should healing be a luxury? My decrees for universal education, for the establishment of village schools and hospitals, were met with less overt resistance from the nobility, who often viewed such matters as beneath their direct notice. But the sheer logistical challenge was immense. Still, I pressed on. I saw the first young minds light up as they deciphered their letters, the gratitude in the eyes of a mother whose child was saved by a physician, not a prayer alone. It was in these small victories against the shadows of poverty and ignorance that I found my deepest satisfaction, a stark contrast to the endless skirmishes on distant borders. One crisp autumn afternoon, a small boy, no older than 6, was led into my court. He bowed with an astonishing formality, then sat at the harpsichord. The music that poured from his tiny fingers was not merely pleasant. It was celestial, a cascade of pure genius, intricate and joyful. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. In that moment, surrounded by the harsh realities of statecraft, the political machinations, and the ever-present threat of war, his music was a balm to my weary soul. It reminded me that even as I fought to preserve the physical empire, I also had a duty to nurture its soul, its culture, its beauty. I embraced him, a fleeting moment of pure joy amidst the storm. The spectre of war, however, never truly receded. Prussia's Frederick, his ambition a constant shadow, was ever at our borders. There was a particular winter, the snow thick on the ground, when news arrived of a devastating defeat in the east. Our forces were scattered, morale was low, and the whispers of surrender began to circulate amongst my own counselors. It would have been easy to yield, to accept a diminished crown for the sake of peace. But the thought sickened me. I stood before them, my voice cutting through the gloom like a sharpened blade. Are we to yield, gentlemen? Are we to cede what generations have fought for? Have we already forgotten the oath I took, the blood spilled for this land? My gaze swept over their faces, challenging each man, daring them to meet my unwavering resolve. We shall rebuild. We shall strategize. We shall fight for every inch of our land, for every soul under my protection. There will be no surrender. Only resolve. The air crackled with my determination. It was a gamble, a defiant stand against overwhelming odds, a woman's will against the might of Europe's greatest military mind. But it rallied them. It rekindled the flame of loyalty and purpose. We did not win every battle, for war is a fickle mistress, but we never broke. And slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. Treaties were signed, alliances forged, the map of Europe subtly but irrevocably shifting. The world began to see that the Habsburg lioness, though initially wounded, would never be truly defeated. 40 years I have sat on this throne, my youth fading into the lines etched around my eyes, lines born of worry and triumph in equal measure. My hair, once the color of burnished gold, is now threaded with silver, a testament to the ceaseless toll of leadership. I inherited an empire fragile as spun glass, surrounded by predators. They had underestimated me, the girl queen. They had seen only my sex, my inexperience. But I saw something else, centuries of heritage, millions of souls awaiting guidance, and a deep, unshakable conviction that I was destined to protect them. I had reshaped my realm, not with the sword alone, but with the pen, with reason, with an unwavering belief in the potential of my people. The feudal shackles were broken, the church and nobility bore their share, and the fruits of education and healthcare were beginning to blossom across the land. Vienna, once a besieged capital, now shone as a beacon of culture and learning. Its universities renowned, its music echoing through grand concert halls. Europe, which once questioned our very existence, now spoke of Austria as a great power, a bulwark, a force to be reckoned with. My children, my many children, had known a safer, stronger empire than I had. The weight on my soul has not lessened, but it has changed, from the terror of imminent collapse to the deep satisfaction of a legacy forged in fire and sustained by will. My reign draws to a close. Soon my son Joseph will bear the crown. He will face his own challenges, for the world never stands still. But he will inherit a realm fundamentally different from the one I found. A realm preserved, strengthened, enlightened. And as I look out over the sprawling city, a murmur of life rising to greet the twilight, I know that I have done my duty. I found an empire dying, and I leave behind one that truly lives.